Have you ever wondered when you see certain plants with the word X between them, what that might mean? Come with me and let's dive into the wonderful world of houseplant hybrids. Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So I want to dive into the awesome world of hybrids today. And you might be asking, what is a hybrid? A hybrid is when you take one plant, usually from the same genus. As far as I'm aware, I don't think you can get hybrids that are from different genuses, but different species. So let me give you an example of a hybrid, one that probably some people have become a bit more aware of in recent years, is the Philodendron Splendid. So the Philodendron Splendid is a hybrid between the Philodendron melanochrysum and the Philodendron verrucosum. Now the world of hybrids is quite large, basically. It is one of those things that generally tends to be things that us as plant collectors, plant hobbyists, tend to mess around and see if we can come up with some interesting new plants. Now, some of the interesting things about hybrids, and you could say the same thing about pets. I know, random, but it is true. I've got enough vet friends or people that work in the veterinary field that have actually said to me on several occasions that dogs, more so I know about dogs, I don't know about other pets necessarily, but more so about dogs, they say a lot of the times the mixed breeds of dogs tend to be better health-wise. And a lot of the times, not always, that can be the same for plants. And the reason for that is if a plant's genetic material for a specific species has got certain downfalls that the other one does not, and vice versa, when they are sharing that genetic material to create that hybrid, the new hybrid essentially will have the best of each of the parent. So if one, and this is just me kind of talking through things, how scientifically accurate this is, I'm not entirely sure, but say for instance, if a plant is a bit more resistant to pests or it gets extra floral nectaries, which means it can deal with pests a bit more, and another plant does not. If you hybridize the two of them, there is a point where the hybrid might start getting extra floral nectaries because this parent has them and this one does not. So the hybrid will have the extra floral nectaries because it will be more adept to dealing with pests. So that is one example. It could be cold tolerances, it could be heat tolerances, it could be humidity tolerances. All of these things make hybrids a really interesting thing. Now, a few of the things that people might be aware of when they see a plant and they might be wondering, is this a hybrid? A lot of the times if you see, so for a long period of time, so the Splendid is more of a trade name. And it's when you might see something like Philodendron melanochrysum x verrucosum, that means that that plant is a hybrid. And I think there is a way, I'm trying to remember now, and I'll see if I can link it at the top. The first parent that's named generally, so if it's Philodendron melanochrysum x verrucosum, so the melanochrysum part of it, I think, suggests the male, so where the pollen has come from in order to pollinate the female, which in this case is the verrucosum. I think that's how it goes. If it is, I love a bit of patriarchy there, because why would the male go first and not the female? I might be wrong, I will put it up the top there. But yeah, so that is something that it does happen. And then obviously, when certain hybrids get popular enough within themselves, somebody might come along and give it a name. This has been going on for years, by the way, because a lot of the trade names, not the botanical names, but the trade names. So a lot of the times you might get plants that from retailers or from plant nurseries, they give it a commercial name, but it's not actually the botanical name. Sometimes those trade names are also hybrids. And be aware sometimes when you see some of these plants, if they've got some form of a trademark or original, things like that, legally speaking, you can propagate for your own use. So a plant that has got a trade name that is protected by the grower because they spent time and money bringing that hybrid to life and bringing it to the market, you cannot then propagate that and sell it on with that name. Does that make sense? Because that is protected intellectual property for the original hybridizer, potentially in this case, that would have been the big plant nursery or grower, basically. So bear that in mind. But yes, so that X generally will suggest, if you see that on a name, that it is a hybrid, but not always, as I said. For instance, now you might get something like the Philodendron Splendid, which is still a hybrid, but it's got a commercial name, essentially. The other thing that you might see sometimes is you might see something like Anthurium Warocqueanum AFF, and that means affinity. That's not necessarily a hybrid, it might be, but it's basically telling you that that plant, they're not entirely sure of exactly what it might be, but based on some morphology and how that plant might behave, they think it's got an affinity towards that parent. So there's a few things when you see AF, at least as far as I understand it. Feel free to correct me if you know for a fact that I am talking rubbish for this one. But with affinity plants, it is a fact that it might just be the species and it just might not be displaying in the more traditional sense, and it's a pure species, it's not a hybrid, or it might be a hybrid and they think at least one of the parents is that plant, basically. So the AF plant, the affinity plant. In the case of the Anthurium Warocqueanum AF, the AF, the parent, at least one of the parents, if not both of the parents, is the Philodendron Warocqueanum. And the reason why this happens is because they might look at it and just go, it looks like a slightly odd version of the Queen Anthurium. We're not 100% sure if it is the Queen Anthurium. Let's just call it an affinity Queen Anthurium, basically. So it kind of works in that way. I'm pretty sure there are methods now that you can get some of these plants if you're really curious and you love a plant specifically and you want to know some of its kind of lineage, so to speak. I think you can send it off and it can get tested. I'm pretty sure that's probably quite expensive. So it would be a plant that you really care about if you want to be spending that kind of money on. And apologies, I'm getting blinded by the light. But you could get it sent off and test it. One final thing when it comes to the naming, we talked about the X, we talked about the affinity, we talked about which parent would go first along that name. There is something to be said as well because, again, we've talked about this on a previous video with italics and the capitalization on non-capitalization. So you'd have a capital letter for the genus, but you wouldn't have a capital letter at the beginning of the species name. There is a slight difference when it is a hybrid as well, and I will hopefully find something to display on the side here as to how it differs. But now that we've gone through some of the background about kind of what is hybrids and a bit of more of the specifics, let's look at one hybrid specifically. And shock horror, we'll be talking about the Philodendron Splendid, as we've touched on it quite heavily in that first section. So the Philodendron Splendid, as I said, is a hybrid between the Melanochrysum and the Verrucosum. And this is, at least my opinion on it, much better than both parents. Again, holds true that we were talking about the genetics of this as well. You do get that reddish blush on the backside of the leaves like you would do with the Verrucosum. You get those much longer, more velvety, I know the Verrucosum is also velvety, but you get those longer, slightly darker leaves that you might get from the Melanochrysum. And I'll hopefully be adding images and pictures here of one of my propagates. I've also done a video, if I'm not mistaken, a review of the Philodendron Splendid. I will add it at the top there. Generally, so it's got the darker leaves, it's got the velvety leaves, it's got the red backs. It doesn't have the level of fuzziness on the petioles that you might get from the Verrucosum on its own. And it is still a climbing plant, but it does get much larger leaves, much faster. So it gets much larger leaves than the Verrucosum, because of the Melanochrysum parentage, but interestingly grows a lot faster than both parents, I find. So you can see it sizing up leaves and getting very, very long leaves much faster. And that's why I'm saying it's better than the Melanochrysum, because at least in my experience, the Melanochrysum does take a while. It's not slow, but it does take a while to get those very long leaves that everybody's kind of looking at. My one might be slightly struggling at the back there, but it's the only place I have for it, and it's probably getting a bit too much light. But yeah, but the Splendid is an interesting one because it does display a lot of that parentage on both sides. The interesting thing with hybrids, however, and let's touch on sometimes the variation that you might get there, is you might get a hybrid, and I'm trying to think if I've ever had this, where the Philodendron Splendid your Philodendron Splendid might be different from my Philodendron Splendid in the sense that yours might have slightly fuzzier petioles than mine do. Generally speaking, most of them will not have as fuzzy of a petiole as you would get from the parent, so the Verrucosum, but there might be some variation between the two. Now, the thing that I don't know with this is the Melanochrysum the pollen donor, or is it the Verrucosum? I don't know. And I also don't know if you'll still get a same hybrid if it's flipped around, basically. Another really popular hybrid that's out on the market is actually the Philodendron Glorious, another one that has got more of a trade name or commercial name, but it's still a hybrid between the Philodendron Melanochrysum and the Philodendron Gloriosum. Again, not entirely sure of kind of how those names need to appear. But again, it exhibits a situation where it has the best from both parents. So unlike the Gloriosum, it's not a scrambler, it's more like the Melanochrysum parent, so it climbs. So that is the big difference there. The other thing as well is, like the Melanochrysum, it can get very long leaves, but because of the Gloriosum's wider leaves, those big heart-shaped leaves, you get slightly wider heart-shaped leaves. And it is quite pretty, and again, I will add images and videos on the side because all of these plants that I've got, the hybrids, are trussed up and they're in difficult places to pick up. But yeah, they can be quite interesting. Neither one of which has got, so they're different from the Splendid because the Splendid will have that blush at the back of the leaves, not quite as dark red as you would get from the Verrucosum, at least in my experience. The Glorious, not the Gloriosum, doesn't have the redness because neither one of the two parents has got that. But generally speaking, I have found that a much more tolerant plant. It's interesting because the Gloriosum for me will grow like a weed and it will tolerate most things as long as it's happy. The Melanochrysum for me is a fussier one. This one's an interesting one because I find for me the Glorious is not as fussy as the Melanochrysum, but definitely more fussy than the Gloriosum. So that's what I'm saying. It doesn't always go fully positive. Again, I can only talk from my own experience. And let's talk Anthurium hybrids. There's a lot of Anthurium hybrids out there, and there's more and more of those coming along, basically. So there's an awful lot of hybrids that are happening with the Anthurium moraqueanum or the Queen Anthurium. I don't think there are as many hybrids that are happening with the Veitchii. There's an awful lot of hybrids that are happening with the Crystallinum. Same thing goes for the Forgetii. And it's an interesting thing with the Anthurium world because the Anthurium papillanum, I think that's how it is, I'll add the name at the top there, is very difficult. The true form is very difficult to come by. There's not that many that you could find easily. However, there is an awful lot of hybrids with the papillanum. Papillanum? Words are hard. Botanical words are harder. But yeah, it is one of those ones that is almost impossible to find. You can find it if you really search for it. And recently I actually got very excited because I saw it on the Grow Tropical website and they had a seedling which was a true form. Way too pricey for my liking, and it's not a plant that I really need to have. But it was very cool to finally see it at least once in my lifetime come up for sale, basically, because it's very difficult to find the true form of that one. But then with Anthuriums, like a really popular one that I'm seeing is the Anthurium luxurians crossed with the radicans. And I can understand that, because if you've ever owned an Anthurium luxurians, they're very, very expensive, especially if you want to get kind of more mature specimens. And if you've ever grown one, you understand why they're so expensive, because at least in my experience, and I think it might hold true for a lot of people, the luxurians is a slow growing Anthurium. So there is that, basically. So I would imagine the reason why it's mixed with the radicans is because the radicans might grow a bit faster. I don't have the radicans, so I'm not entirely sure, but I am making that assumption basically here. And the leaves have still got that kind of corrugated texture that you get with the luxurians, but generally speaking, when I've seen that hybrid, it comes at a much lower price. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens in the world of Anthuriums. So in the world of Anthuriums, because there's all of us and we all get very excited to do pollinations and do cross-pollinations, because we've got, usually we might have one Anthurium of one species and another Anthurium of another species. Very rarely would you have multiples of the same Anthurium. You might do. If you're really into your Anthuriums, that's fine, you do you. So a lot of the times we will do crosses ourselves, which means, at least this has been from what I've seen, a lot of the Anthurium crosses, not all of them, and there are some severe exceptions to this, tend to be quite cheap to purchase as well, because there's almost, at least from what I can see, there's the kind of notion that with Anthuriums you want it to be a thoroughbred, you want it to be the species and not the hybrid, because there's probably so many hybrids that are coming out all the time, because they're relatively easy to cross-pollinate within kind of your own collection. The philodendrons arguably don't come up as much, because I don't know about you, but it's very rare that I will get a philodendron that I've owned, and I've got some big specimens at this point, to flower. Let alone get one to flower and then get a different one to flower at the same time or close to the same time, so I can cross-pollinate, and whether or not that's going to be viable as well. So there is something that I want to talk here again about: Anthurium cross-pollination and viability. So viability is an interesting one because, and I've spoken to a few of you, usually on my Instagram through DMs, where you're trying to do specific crosses, just mainly because you've said, I've got this plant, I've crossed it. There is sometimes an issue with viability of whether or not they might kind of germinate, and you might get seedlings, and you might get seeds, and you might even get seedlings, but not a lot might happen after that. At that point, it might just be that those plants, unfortunately, are picking up issues from both parents, and they're not going to end up ever being truly good plants or viable plants. So there is that. And sometimes it might even be as simple in terms of fixing a viability issue as flipping the parents around. So who is the parent plant, the parent species plant that is giving the pollen? So for instance, if the queen Anthurium is being cross-pollinated with the king Anthurium, for instance, I don't even know if there is that kind of a mix actually. Possibly if there isn't such a mix, because both of those two plants are quite popular, I would imagine it's probably because it's not viable. But, might be wrong. But it is one of those things that if, say, for instance, say there was a way of doing it, say getting the pollen from the queen Anthurium and pollinating a king Anthurium, that maybe doesn't lead to a viable seed or a viable plantlet, basically. But getting the pollen from the king Anthurium and then pollinating the queen Anthurium might do. And then you might get a viable seed and a seedling and a viable plant. So there's all of these things to consider. The thing that I was mentioning before, that the price isn't always low with hybrids, is that certain hybrids that have desirable traits, so the darker leafed Anthuriums, or the ones that have come in with really big blushes, or with a lot of silvery veination or interesting shapes, those ones tend to get a bit more of a hype, and they tend to not only be more expensive than kind of like a more pedestrian hybrid that everybody else might be able to do, but they tend to be very expensive, usually more expensive than either one of the two parents alone, basically. So there are a few that get done, especially when they're coming in, I think, is it Doc Block? There's one individual that brings out really interesting hybrids, and there's not that many of them, and they're very desirable, and they go up in price exceptionally quickly. I think there was one that came around recently. I saw it. I'm into Anthuriums. I'm not that much into Anthuriums, so I'm probably not going to be buying it at the price level that it is now. It's an interesting one. If it drops in price at some point, I probably will, but not right now. So there is a whole world of hybrids out there. You might be watching this video and kind of saying, okay, now what? Now it's your choice, basically, on what you want to do. You might have some Anthuriums and you might want to cross-pollinate them. Go for it. Don't instantly assume that they're going to have a high value. They might do to you because you've taken the time and you've seen them grow, and you can be like a bit of a mad scientist and do that there. And that there is true value in that. I still love all my little cross-pollination seedlings that I've done for my Anthurium. However, a lot of people are doing cross-pollination, so they don't have that high of a value all the time. You might stumble across something really interesting. And all of these things, by the way, they take time. They take time. I've got some seedlings from a cross-pollination that I did a year or two ago, and they're still not particularly huge yet. It might be because I've probably not given them the care that they need, but you know. But yeah, the other thing as well you might want to consider is, if you like the idea of a Gloriosum but you don't want a scrambling plant, consider something like a Glorious, because the Glorious won't have that scrambling nature and you can grow it up, basically. It's interesting because some of these hybrids, and thinking with my kind of plant review hat, kind of knowing what I know now, if I didn't have these plants, would I get it? Interesting thing is, would I have purchased the Verrucosum knowing what I know now? Absolutely not. Would I have purchased the Splendid instead? 100%. With the Glorious, and I had higher hopes for the Glorious, I was really hoping I was going to like the Glorious more than I like the Splendid. On the side of it, I would have preferred the Glorious rather than the Gloriosum, because I do have a Gloriosum now, and at this point, I get why sometimes these are better left out in the garden if you've got that kind of climate, because the scramblers, when they get big and when they get robust, it's a bit like, you're so difficult, I can't place you anywhere, you grow in a really awkward way in relation to this. It's very specific to this condition. So I really wanted to like the Glorious, but nah. But yeah, so it's up to you as to what you prefer and what you want out of the specific plant. Hybrid might be great for you. You might not like the idea of a hybrid. You might want the true species form. That's great. But be aware as well that sometimes the hybrids are easier to care for. I think that's what I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully you found it interesting. Have you got any really fun hybrids of your own that you want to talk about down below, or any of the ones that I've mentioned and you've had good experiences, bad experiences? Let me know. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.